Belden Lane is Professor Emeritus of Theological Studies at St. Louis University. He's the author of numerous books, including The Solace of Fierce Landscapes, exploring desert and mountain spirituality, and Backpacking with the Saints, wilderness hiking as spiritual practice. Belden Lane is a true elder. In our conversation today, he exhibits that when we talk about wild places, the rough play and laughter of God, the grief of losing a son, and what we can learn from trees, and so much more. As always, you can visit Contemplify.com for the show notes on this episode and sign up for the monthly Contemplify non-required reading list. Now join me in raising a glass to my guest today, Belden Lane. I always like to begin just by naming the location one finds himself in. Where are we finding you today? What's the location and what's the surroundings that you're in?
I am in my office in our house on the outer edge of St. Louis in Missouri, and land. I know this has become kind of rote lately. Land originally belonging to Potawatomi and Osage peoples, but I don't say that just routinely. I feel through the trees, especially around me, the roots of this land that belongs to far more than people in St. Louis today. So that's where I am.
I appreciate that. I have so many questions I'm excited to ask you, but I want to begin first, if you don't mind, with what is the etymology of your name, if you don't mind sharing? I remember you referencing that in Backpacking with the Saints.
Yes,
I would love to hear.
Delight in my name. It's given me, it's the name of my great-grandfather that I never knew. He was from Cornwall in southwest England. And Belden in Cornish means beautiful green hill. And Kerno is Cornwall. So I am by name a place which fascinates me, a green hill in Cornwall.
That seems to make a lot of sense for what animates your soul and the ways that you write, that your name would be a place. That rings true for me. This podcast, Contemplify, we like to focus on the contemplative life, which has so many various meanings for so many different folks. I'm wondering for you, Belden, when you hear that word contemplative, how does that moniker relate to you or your work, if you think it does at all?
Yeah, I would guess for the last 30 years that a contemplative practice has been profoundly important for me. Every morning I'm out for an hour or more of solitude, well, along with my golden retriever, Joey, in a gazebo my son and I built about 15 years ago in the backyard under trees. And then at night, I'm over with grandfather, a 100-year-old cottonwood that's been dear to me for those 30 years, in the park where I also spend time in contemplative prayer. So solitude and silence are absolutely crucial. A contemplative life of some sort that carries on a discipline. I love Rilke. He said, "What is necessary after all is only this, solitude, vast inner solitude, to walk inside yourself and meet no one for hours." I love that.
Oof.
Yeah, to walk inside yourself and meet no one for hours.
Wow. I feel like whenever in doubt, just go back to Rilke, and he's said something that will anchor you in a place of depth.
Yes.
Belden, I know that your name is familiar to a lot of folks who are listening. You've been a requested guest on the podcast. But for those who don't know you, so if someone were going to teach a class on the formation of Belden Lane, what would you say would be the 3 mandatory works? They could be reading, they could be pieces of art, or particular places that formed you that would definitely be on that syllabus?
Yeah, that's a great question. First, without a doubt, would be the sayings of the Desert Fathers. I've been drawn most of my life to empty, desolate places that are strangely healing. And those Desert Fathers that left Roman society in the 4th century, going into the desert, practiced what they called apatheia, a fierce indifference to unimportant things. It comes from our word not to be apathetic. Being apathetic about the right things is very important, a fierce indifference to unimportant things. And for them, that was a countercultural spirituality, rejecting the militarism, the consumerism, the cultivation of a reputation, an ego that was so central in the culture at that time and our time. And so that place of desert terrain, whether it's the Southwest U.S. or the desert of Egypt, where you run out of language, where theological language, of course, just gives out completely. That would be the first book or work in my formation. I think the second would be I'm thinking of a matched set of Martin Luther's Galatians commentary and Julian of Norwich's showings. And both of those have to do with God's acceptance of me, which is way beyond my control. I do nothing to earn love. My failures, my sins are absolutely forgiven, not because of anything I do, not because of earning God's approval, which was so crucial, what I thought I had to do growing up, coming out of a fundamentalist, very legalistic background in the past. So that Luther's freedom in reminding me that I'm saved by grace alone is wonderful. And then Julian adding to that not only are my sins forgiven, but they were necessary all along. That you don't get to where you need to grow in your spiritual life by doing the right things, but by making mistakes. It's ironic. And she goes so far as to say that we will wear our sins as a badge in heaven, because that's what got us there. Not all the things that we did in making an impression on God, but all the ways we were broken and came to the place where our brokenness could be healed. So that would be the second text. And then the last would be Wendell Berry, a farmer poet I absolutely love. His emphasis that everything is bound together in relationship. He develops this wonderful fictional place called Port William, Kentucky. And there in his novels and his short stories, everything's part of a membership. The farmers like Burley Coulter, the bottom land along the river, draft horses in the barn, the town barber, even bacteria in the compost pile, all part of a membership. And he says, we're all members of each other. The difference ain't in who is a member and who is not, but in who knows it and who don't. And I'm growing into that deeper sense of membership with the whole created world, which is absolutely wonderful. By the way, I finally broke down and wrote Wendell Berry several weeks ago. I'd hesitated, not wanting to waste his time with my writing to tell him how much of a hero he was for me. But I did, to write him to say that all that I'd done as a writer and what I'd become as a man was so indebted to him. And he wrote me 2 weeks later. I got a handwritten note back from Wendell Berry saying, he couldn't accept all of my praise. He said, I am but a concentration of gifts from elsewhere. And
Wow.
that's classic Wendell Berry. He knows he's just part of a membership of all the things that make us. So those three texts, I would say, would be on the syllabus, first of all.
Wow, Wendell. Wow, Belden. That is a list that is dear to my heart. And uh, Wendell Berry has been one of those mentors and teachers from afar, much like you have been for me.
Yeah, isn't he amazing?
He's amazing. And I think Burley Coulter is one of my favorite characters in literature ever.
Yes.
Just sings to my soul in ways that I remember in the story in which Burley passes, just sobbing at the loss of him and the way that the membership rallied around him. I can feel that being moved in this moment, just recollecting that. And of course, Julian and Martin Luther and the Desert Fathers, you, in so many ways, you have helped bring them to life for me and so many others. So I'm not surprised by that list, but it makes me smile to know that those are the folks that come to mind in this moment. I do want to talk about your work because I think you hold this particular place of what you're drawn to and how you show up in place, and how the spirituality of a place speaks to you, and also the lineage of the mystical traditions and poetic traditions meet you there. And I wanted to ask you this question, where in Backpacking with the Saints, you talk about grandiosity and littleness. And you invoke another character who I enjoy, Ed Abbey, and Therese of Lisieux as guides. I'm curious, for you, how do these luminaries offer light on relating to both grandiosity and littleness in the examined life?
Well, most people would never think to put those two names in the same sentence. Ed Abbey, this gruff, rough desert rat from New Mexico, Arizona, and Therese of Lisieux, this marvelous young nun in France in the late 19th, early 20th century. So utterly different, and yet so interestingly similar to me. Abbey goes into the desert. He says, you got to get out there. You can't see anything from a car. You got to get out of the goddamn contraption and walk. Better yet, crawl, he says, on your hands and knees. And when traces of blood begin to mark your trail, you might see something. So Abbey's convinced that the desert is good for you because it leaves you undone. And he's got this huge ego, wanting to be a great writer, wanting to be a Don Juan with all the women, wanting to just be everything and as wild as he can be. And then you have Therese of Lisieux, who says, in effect, the same kind of thing. You have to enter a radical nothingness. You've got to become a little thing, the littlest thing, because God delights in little things. She says it's not grandiose sacrifices, but it's doing the smallest thing, a smile here, a word of kindness there, and doing it in love. That's what counts. And what intrigues me is that this is said by a woman who had as grandiose an ego as Ed Abbey did. She wanted to be the greatest saint of all, dreamed of becoming a saint, and realizes, like Abbey, that she's got to be cut off at the knees if she's going to encounter the mystery of love. So both of them say, in effect, you have to lose yourself in order to find yourself.
One of those patterns that I love when discovered. It seems to fill a person's entire body and being if they discover losing yourself to fulfill yourself. And I love the way you talk about that.
It's the great paradox that it takes a lifetime to live through.
Yeah, I know. For me, I feel like I'm just scratching the surface.
Me too.
As an avid backpacker myself, and knowing that you've spent a lot of time in the wilds, what do you think makes a good backpacking companion? Whether they're an avid hiker or a dead saint, who do you bring along in your companionship or in your conscience?
Oh, I think of friends we have in common, Mike Bennett and Doug Christie, who we've had some wonderful times in wilderness. So a great companion is wonderful. But for me, it's curious. I've taken saints with me. Uh, Taking along a few pages from the writings of one of the saints or mystics has been a really fruitful exercise. Someone defined a classic as a book that could be dangerous because it could change your life. And so to take a potentially dangerous book out into a potentially dangerous place, at least a place that kind of puts you on the edge, that brings out both the power of the text and of the place. And it's interesting to me. I started backpacking as a real discipline, a spiritual discipline, about when I turned 40, which Carl Jung would love. Uh, I had made tenure here at St. Louis University, and that first half of life, you're on the ascent. And then you start a descent in the second half of life, Jung said. And to realize that I needed to go into an external wilderness in order to access the internal wilderness within me, and to do it with some of the great mystics of the past. That's just been a marvelous practice I've fallen into and loved.
It inspires me, and I'm curious, Belden, who is a mystic of late who's most speaking to your soul or to that interior landscape?
Oh, wow. I've just been undone by Hadovich. What would be today Belgium, this 12th century nun who spoke about her deepest experiences of God being in her most awful experiences of hell. That and to travel with her into, as I'm anticipating we all are now, moving toward the Triduum, moving toward Good Friday, Holy Saturday, Easter Sunday. That Holy Saturday, Hadwich would say, is the most important of all, because that's when Jesus goes to hell and enters into the darkest, most god-awful place where you can't imagine anything worse happening. And in terms of my having lost my son, our son 2 years ago to cancer, leaving us a 6-year-old beautiful granddaughter, there's been a journey into hell spiritually with John, my son, and to find Jesus already there with Hadovich has been a unnerving, disturbing, but incredibly powerful and beautiful, freeing experience. So you got to be careful with these mystics. They'll take you where you don't want to go. I assure you.
That is truth. And I love that you said Hadowich, because she has been, I was reading Doug Christie's The Insurmountable Darkness of Love.
Yes,
year.
Isn't it great?
It's so good. It's so good. And Hadowich makes a significant presence. And there's one of her poems I would love to read now and just get your take on it. Because I also know it's in Solace of Fierce Landscapes in a different translation. But she says this: I do not complain of suffering for love. It becomes me always to submit to her. Whether she commands in storm or stillness, one can know her only in herself. This is an unconceivable wonder, which has thus filled my heart and makes me stray in a wild desert.
She knew the storms and the stillness. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Incredible.
Thank
Incredible.
you.
Um, and I want to say I'm so sorry for the loss of your son 2 years
Yeah,
ago to
thank you.
cancer. Um, I cannot imagine that as a father myself. And you also have written about that process in the Christian Century
Mhm.
um, in a remarkably vulnerable way. I You share a journey of going to Ghost Ranch here in New Mexico and being exposed to the elements uh, as a vision quest, as a place of meeting John and grieving John. How are you able to articulate how that process, even as you wrote about it, how has that continued to have ripple effects in your own life as you've look at this beautiful 6-year-old, as you still feel that loss? How are
Mhm.
you holding that now?
Um, it fascinates me how at times in my life, and I look back, uh, all the broken places, my father's suicide when I was 13, nervous breakdown and doctoral work, mother's dying of Alzheimer's back when I was going through a midlife crisis, and then
Mm.
most recently John's death. These god-awful things that recur in my life as somehow, and there is absolutely no logic to this, but that somehow uh, God is in that with me, and finding God's presence, as agonizing and as comforting as that can be, in the desert is always intriguing. Uh, I knew this was about a year after John's dying that I had to get back to the desert. Had to, especially that area around Ghost Ranch. There's the red rock uh, outcroppings just south of the ranch off the highway there that I've always loved. There's something about red rock that just speaks to the soul. And somehow going to when you were empty, going to an empty place like the desert is strangely healing. I think of homeopathic medicine, where they say treating like with like. You prescribe a substance that mimics the symptoms. So if you're sneezing and a runny nose, you eat onions, uh,
Mm.
as if it were to produce that onion soup. That there is a strange kind of uh, healing when you're out of language, out of anything, to go to a place without any language that's only solitude and silence. It is uncanny sometimes how God meets me there. And so it certainly was the case of thinking at the time that John must be struggling on the other side, having thought, what the hell? Here I've gone through the 12 steps. I've been through recovery. My life has changed. I've got a wonderful wife and daughter. And what is this about, God, that here I am dead? And I have felt that I needed to go and offer comfort, to somehow find a gift for John. And what I found, that he was there, he was fine. I was the one that had to deal with my anger and rage and lostness. So God has a crazy way of loving and bulldozing us into love.
Mm.
I cannot explain it. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. This connects to there's a passage in Solace of Fierce Landscapes where you write about relationship to God playing rough before breaking into laughter. And it's an image that is, I find, comforting with its sharp edges. but also there's a void likeness to it. And I'm curious for you, how does the desert tradition embody this physicality of rough play and gut busting laughter?
Yeah, I love that. I've always felt that in my writing, I was at least 5 or 10 years ahead of myself in terms of writing about what I hadn't yet lived into. And this is still the case, but it fascinates me. My deepest meetings with God, as I've said, most often or very often begin with fear, only to be ravished by love in the end. I think of that story in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where Lucy hears about this lion that's loose, and she's afraid of the White Witch, but she's not sure about this lion either, Aslan the lion. And she asks Mr. Beaver if he's safe. And Mr. Beaver says, "Why, dearie, of course he's not safe, but he's good." And there is that quality of God that I delight in, and have found that God uses God's grandeur, God's fearsomeness, so often for the sake of love. Ellie, she loves to frighten me. She has a mask, and she will put on this mask and pretend to growl, and I'll pretend to be really scared, and then all of a sudden she'll take off the mask, and she'll say, "It's only me, Babu. It's only me." And she loves to. Isn't that interesting? The child loves to see the adult move from fear into release and love. And isn't that what God longs for as well? So I'm intrigued that as I move now into where I'm going next, whatever that means, I'm intrigued by the holy fool, the image of the sage, the Chinese sage Pu Tai, with the frog on his head playing in the dirt with children. Or Saint Simeon, the desert father who was always afraid of spiritual groupies coming to the desert. They wanted to just gawk at a holy man. So he would climb the palm tree outside of his hut and start polishing the branches, or he'd sit down in front of the hut, stuffing himself with bread and cheese. And people would come and they say, "Who is this? Where is the holy Simeon?" And he didn't want to make anything of his spirituality. He wanted to invite them into the foolishness of their own gawking at others' spirituality. And so this breaking into laughter, this giving oneself as an old man to hilarity, is something that is it in a sense only as you've been through, or especially maybe as you've been through enough darkness in your life, that you're invited into the light and laughter of something utterly new? I don't know, but I'm intrigued, called, invited by it.
I love that musing on that. I can see the way you're being drawn into that space of the holy fool, which, it sounds derogatory, but it feels like an actual crown to wear, particularly this story of regards to your granddaughter. That image is so striking of the fear to foolishness and the playfulness of that act, and all for the delight of a child. It is self-forgetful in that way.
Yeah. I'm involved in the Illumin movement that Richard Rohr, there at CAC with you, of course, founded years ago. And we have started in the last few years elders' rites of passage for men entering into retirement and into the last third of their life or whatever. And one of the things we invite them to is this grand tradition in Christianity and really in all the faiths of the holy fool who lives a life of contradiction. different from society, but for the purpose of inviting people into a ego-free carefreeness and delight and new capacity to love. Yeah. It's what old men ought to do. There's
Yes.
a hell of a lot of old men in our country that could use absolutely some lessons in holy foolishness instead of inadvertent foolishness.
Yes. Yes. I so appreciate that. And I think of the ways like those are exactly the elders that I'm drawn to, who don't have the stick up the butt, but have that vitality and that they're spilling over with life, and it comes out in laughter. It comes out in that exuberance.
Yeah. And you see it every day, of course, in Richard. God bless him.
Yeah. Yes. So there's obviously so many things I would love to talk about. So there's this little fun conversational game, for lack of a better term, that I like to play where I'm going to go over a quote or a theme from your book or your life that kind of caught my eye, and then ask you if you think it's overrated or underrated for kindling the contemplative life. So I'll give you I'll give you one, and then ask you if you think it's overrated or underrated, and then you could share your response to whatever full extent you want to about what you think about that.
I suspect most of it would be overrated if it's written by me, but go ahead.
All right. Overrated or underrated for kindling the contemplative life? The I and it marketplace conception of the world.
Yeah, well, that takes me right back to Wendell Berry's sense of membership. That if we are just standing over the rest of the world as subjects to its object, making it, objectifying it, whether it's the poor, whether it's landscape, whether it's the women in our lives, whatever. That is certainly not overrated as the importance of what we need to move beyond an I-it relationship to an I-thou relationship with God and with others, all the others.
Amen. All right, our next one. Calvinism, is it overrated or underrated for kindling the contemplative life?
Oh, wow. You know, I come out of a Calvinist background for all the good and all the bad that's involved in that. I wrote a book that was really important for me. It took me years to write it, called Ravished by Beauty, the surprising legacy of Reformed spirituality. I had taught at a Catholic university for 25 years, and I was asking myself, having come to so appreciate the sacramental theology of the Catholic tradition, what was there in my own Reformed tradition that I could still value? And I found a lot that surprised me. But I would say, by and large, there are better routes to my routes through Calvinism and through fundamentalism served me so well, I wouldn't redo anything in my life if I had to live it over. But there must be easier ways, I think, to move into God's grace. But maybe not. I don't know.
Thank you for that. All right, our next one. Overrated or underrated for kindling the contemplative life? Distinguishing between work and a job.
Yeah, I think that's underrated. I love Peter Matheson's book on the snow leopard, where he was going with this scientist who was exploring sheep in the Himalayas. And Matheson went along with the hope of maybe seeing an elusive snow leopard. And The job for the one was a scientist trying to track down the number of sheep in the area, and for Matheson as an author to find something exciting and moving that he could write about. And yet they both found that their work was different from their day-to-day job. That the work, for Matheson especially, he never saw the snow leopard. He knew he was seen by it several times, which is interesting. I've had that experience myself, being seen in wilderness at night by something that's out there that takes you to your work. And your work is a deep practice of dismantling of ego and of invitation into the true self. That's your work, your lifetime work, as opposed to the way you make money and get along from day to day in your job. So in our culture, jobs are so much overrated when it comes to the work that we really need to be doing.
Amen. All right, our next one. Overrated or underrated for kindling the contemplative life? The indifference of the desert.
I have found indifference to be profoundly important. It's a big part of moving through that experience of being undone, of finding yourself without language, without ego power you can rely on. And the desert Christians went into the desert intentionally because of its indifference to unimportant things, so as to invite them to care about what really matters in the end. And so being indifferent to my identity as a professor, which I've been out of for 10 years now, retired, and have delighted in being able to get the university out of my system. Being able to give up all the ways that you identify yourself, being indifferent to all the things you once thought you were that were so important, and to be able to celebrate what really matters. I am a pretty good grandfather. I am a friend to a tree across the street that he's never had a human friend like me. Those are things far more important than a husband that I've finally become, that my wife delights in. So yeah, indifference to what doesn't matter is profoundly important.
Amen to that. Our next one, overrated or underrated for kindling the contemplative life. I had the specific of poetry of Hadowich, but I just want to say poetry in general. What do you think, overrated or underrated for kindling the contemplative life?
Oh, far underrated. With the desert, whether you're thinking physically or symbolically, what it does is to strip you of language, and the only language you have left when discursive language runs out, the language that tries to explain, that tries to articulate, all you've got left is storytelling and poetry. And it intrigues me that that's what all of these people that we've been talking about, what they fall back into again and again. So, yeah, the poets from Rumi to Hafiz, in the Muslim tradition, to Mary Oliver, of course, and David White and others today. These have been profoundly important for me and for all of us. And I love it in the men's work. Men, having been kind of held poetry at a distance for much of their lives, just fall in love with it when they get into it and become poets themselves. Yeah.
Yeah. Gosh, that's been true for me. I feel like every year I get older, the more poets I fall in love with. Here's the last one for this overrated, underrated. The quote by Karl Barth, "God is most God on the cross and most man in the resurrection." Is that overrated or underrated for kindling the contemplative life?
God is most God on the cross and most man in the resurrection. When I think of the Triduum coming up, the 3 days, Good Friday and the death of God on the cross in Jesus, and seeing God most fully in that utter breakage, loss, emptiness, that God is willing to go to this extent to be God in the lowercase, to give up, as in Philippians 2, that passage of kenosis where Paul says, God didn't think equality, Jesus didn't think equality with God to be valued, but was emptied. That is God at God's best. That's the God, not a God showing the power of love, showing the love of power, but a God showing the power of love. And then in the resurrection, to think that we are resurrected, that we become new humans, that the deepest humanity of ourselves is not, as I was taught as a kid growing up, that original sin is the first and most important thing to be said about us, that we are rotten toads, that kind of corrupt Calvinism.
Yeah.
But that we are absolutely beautiful beings created in God's very image and resurrected into that image to be beings of light that are extraordinary. Yeah, I think this is underrated. We want to turn God into a great power as opposed to the God we see most powerfully in the cross, and we want to turn humans into toads as opposed to the wonderful beings we see in the resurrection.
Love that. Thank you. I want to follow up. You had mentioned something about your neighbor tree. And part of what I hear you saying that is not only the friendship, but this kind of posture of being an apprentice to something other than human. And I'm wondering what you are learning, approaching that tree as friend and potentially elder in this season of your life.
Yeah, I call him grandfather. He is a male cottonwood tree, about 100 years old, as I said. I first got to know him 30 years ago when one of the two trunks from his roots was blown down in a lightning strike and storm, leaving this hollow in the side where I go in the wounded side of this tree to contemplify. I've been intrigued by trees, especially as my most important grandfather in particular, but trees in general. And I'm writing more on them now, and I've been intrigued most recently with the tree saints. They were called dendrites, from the Greek word for tree or wood. In 4th, 5th century Syria, Greece, they were monks who lived in trees. You know, the desert monks went into the desert. The tree monks went into the trees.
Wow.
They wanted to identify with Christ on the tree of the cross, sharing in a bloodless crucifixion through their ascetic life. But they also admired trees for what they had to teach them. Their rootedness, their monastic stability, their fruitfulness in service to others, and their habit of constantly reaching for the light. They knew that these trees were continually becoming other than themselves, always undergoing transformation from one season to the next, losing leaves, sprouting new leaves, moving from death into life, etc. And one saint in particular that was very popular was a 5th century saint called Saint David the Dendrite of Thessaloniki. There's an icon of him. The top of half of his body is in the top of a tree, and the bottom half of his body is the tree and its trunk itself, so that the saint has virtually become, or the tree they become each other through the process of their spiritual growth together. So I would love nothing more than to become a cottonwood tree with this old, wonderful old tree that I befriend every day and who befriends me.
Wow. What an image. And is that a project you're working on? It's, you said as you explore those tree saints, you're delving in some writing about that.
Yes.
Well, that's exciting. I want to ask, just as we start to come to a close here, just recognizing the turbulence of our times, of, whether it's mass media, whether it's the economy, whether it's political turmoil, these things that always go on when you live in interesting times. And so much of our culture teaches us to distract ourselves, either by substances or cultural addictions. How do you keep the edges hot in kindling your own contemplative life for your own becoming as you feel the heat of almost the constant tragedy of life around us? Are there ways in which you have these contemplative practices that you've spoken about? Are there other ways that you lean into that for your own becoming at this stage?
It is crucially important for me to not only be involved in solitude and silence each day, but also to be involved somehow regularly with people on the edge, people in food deserts. I help with the food pantry at our church. And every Wednesday afternoon, we have people that honor us by coming in for food that they can't get in their own neighborhoods. And I delight in being blessed by those people. And I have 2 friends. I walk in spiritual direction with half a dozen men. But there are 2 men in particular that are both dying of cancer. One who I spoke to, he's just had a stroke the other night. He's 6 days now into not being fed. He may pass today. John Dupuy, God bless him. And to talk with him yesterday, to read a blessing from Ed Abbey, who had been John's closest friend. They'd done wild things together in their youth. And then another man nearby, 3 blocks from us, who's just 40, and he's wrestling with esophageal cancer. Being with people on the edge, the poor, those in need, those who model for me the vulnerability and evoke the compassion that are necessary for me. Those 2 things are just as important as the time for contemplation. And of course, as CAC would say, it's contemplation that leads necessarily to action, and action reverting back always as well to contemplation.
Wow. Thank you for that very generous response about how you are stepping into those hot edges and how you seek that out. And we always like to close our conversations, Belden, by asking the guest if you're going to pair this conversation with a drink, anything from water to whiskey, what would be your drink of choice and why?
Well, that's an easy one. uh, Most always on my backpacking trips, one tiny little weight that I'll bring along is an ounce of Jameson's Irish whiskey, which, of course, out of my Celtic tradition, would be holy. And to share a wee dram around a little fire, if you were to build a fire at night in the wilderness, would be a wonderful thing. And it's our talking together has been a like that. I've appreciated this very much. Both a sense of quiet reflection around the fire with a taste of Jameson's, and then to take the last wee drop or two and throw it in the fire to watch it flame up in a wild rage, brief as that is. We've touched all of those pieces in our time together, and I'm grateful for that, Paul. Bless you. Thank you for your work.
Thank you, Belden. I hope someday we can have a wee dram together.
Hey, that sounds good.
And thank you for being an elder to so many of us through your words and your work. We don't ever say it enough. Thank you so much for that. You're modeling a way that we all of us are seeking to live into.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Contemplify. May it refresh you and be a contemplative refuge. And perhaps maybe a moment or two will walk with you along the rest of your day. You can slide over to contemplify.com to find the show notes for this episode, including links to the resources mentioned in this conversation. And while you're there, you can also sign up for the monthly Contemplify non-required reading list, which I tee up with a contemplative musing, then reflect on a few books that have come across my desk, and wink at the art and articles stilling my soul. If you're enjoying Contemplify, please rate and review it on your podcast player. The internet's a huge place. This helps spread the contemplative cheer. The theme song for Contemplify is called Langside by Charles Enns and Darren Hovius. Fellas, thanks as always. For Season 4 of Contemplify, I want to offer a nod. This is not an ad, but a nod of appreciation. This nod goes out to the Center for Spiritual Imagination. The Center for Spiritual Imagination exists to deepen and enrich human relationships with God, self, and neighbor in new and ancient ways. I can say with certainty that some of you listening, the offerings from the Center for Spiritual Imagination are exactly what you have been longing for. Check it out at spiritualimagination.org. And as always, I'm looking forward to bringing you more musings and more conversations with contemplatives in the world here in the near future. Until then, be well.